The champagne tasted bitter despite its $1,000 price tag as I watched Greg check his Rolex for the fourth time in 20 minutes. His forced smile never reached his eyes when he glanced my way across the candlelit table at Ciel, the most exclusive restaurant in Westbrook Heights. I smoothed my silk Hermès scarf, a gift from my late husband, and took another deliberate sip, savoring not just the vintage bubbles, but the delicious knowledge that by tomorrow evening, my son-in-law's carefully crafted world would shatter, like the crystal flutes he was so proud of displaying in the mansion that wasn't actually his. "Another glass of Dom Pérignon for the table," Greg announced more than asked, gesturing to the hovering sommelier. His voice carried that practiced confidence he'd perfected in boardrooms across the country, the same voice that had declared to my daughter Madeline just yesterday that I was too much of a liability to be included in their upcoming renewal ceremony. What Greg failed to realize as he ordered another bottle with his trademark flourish was that I had already seen the private text messages on Madeline's tablet when she asked me to check her calendar last week. "Make sure Eleanor isn't included," he'd written to their event planner. "She's too old and unsophisticated for the aesthetic we're going for. Besides, we need to impress the Harrington group, not remind them we're connected to her generation." Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I hadn't always been Eleanor the liability. 7 years ago, when Greg first entered our lives with his ambitious smile and impressive business degree, he'd called me inspirational and a force of nature. He'd charmed me as thoroughly as he had my daughter, asking about the properties my husband Charles had acquired throughout his career, listening with what seemed like genuine interest to the stories of how we'd built Burke Enterprises from nothing. Back then, I thought his questions stemmed from admiration for Charles's legacy. How perfectly naive I had been. The irony of tonight's dinner, supposedly to discuss Madeline's upcoming birthday celebration, wasn't lost on me as I watched. Greg motioned for the waiter. For 35 years, I had learned to read board members and business rivals across polished tables just like this one. I could distinguish genuine smiles from calculated ones, could detect the slight muscle tension around the eyes that signaled deception. At 72, I recognized how easily my silver hair and sensible shoes led men like Greg to underestimate me. They saw only an aging widow, not the woman who had co-founded a real estate empire worth millions, who still retained controlling interest in every property bearing the Burke name. Greg's phone chimed with another message, and the momentary flash of annoyance crossing his features told me everything I needed to know. "Trouble with the Westlake renovation?" I asked innocently, referring to the historic mansion that had become his signature achievement, the property he'd been photographed beside in business magazines and local society pages. The contractor mentioned some permit issues when I spoke with him this morning. The flash of alarm in his eyes was subtle but unmistakable. "You've been speaking with Howard?" His voice maintained its smooth professionalism, but his fingers tightened imperceptibly around the stem of his glass. "Just some questions about the original blueprints," I replied, maintaining eye contact. He seemed confused about who had authorized the changes to the East Wing. I explained that despite what he'd been told, the property was still under Burke Holdings management. That wasn't entirely true. I hadn't spoken to Howard directly, but my assistant Vivian certainly had, along with the city planning office, the historical society, and every contractor who had worked on the restoration project Greg claimed as his personal triumph. As the sommelier returned with another bottle, I allowed myself a small smile. In precisely 18 hours, the quarterly meeting of Burke Holdings would convene, and the elaborate house of cards Greg had constructed over the past 5 years would collapse spectacularly. Everything had been meticulously arranged. The documentation gathered, the witnesses prepared, the legal paperwork filed. Like a chess master positioning pieces for checkmate, I had spent the past month systematically preparing for the moment when Greg would discover that his carefully orchestrated, Life, built on properties he didn't own and money he hadn't earned, existed entirely at my discretion. "To your remarkable success," I said, raising my glass in a toast that made his expression flicker with momentary uncertainty. If he only knew that while he'd been planning a lavish ceremony to elevate his social standing, a ceremony that deliberately excluded his wife's mother. I had been quietly meeting with Arthur Goldman, our family attorney for 30 years, documenting every instance where Greg had misrepresented ownership of Burke properties, including the Westlake Mansion. He claimed to have personally renovated with his visionary insight. The waiter approached with our appetizers, seared scallops for me, foie gras for Greg. The restaurant hummed with quiet conversation and the gentle clink of silverware against fine china. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city lights of Westbrook Heights glimmered like stars fallen to earth, a view I had first shared with Charles when this building was merely architectural drawings in our office. The Burke Building, they called it now, though Greg had taken to referring to it as our family's first development in interviews. Our family. The presumption still stung, even as I prepared to correct it permanently. I took a bite of the perfectly seared scallop, remembering how Madeline had called me 3 months ago, confused about some paperwork she'd found in Greg's home office. Transfer documents for properties that had been in the Burke family for generations, with signatures that didn't quite match my own. "It must be a misunderstanding," she'd said, her voice tinged with the desperate need to believe in the man she had married. Greg would never, but he had. He'd forged signatures, misrepresented ownership to investors, and leveraged properties. He didn't control to fund ventures that enhanced his personal brand rather than the company's portfolio. Greg was midway through an elaborate explanation of his latest business triumph when my phone discreetly vibrated with a message from Vivian. "Final documents signed by Judge Harmon, all set for tomorrow." I slipped the phone back into my purse, without responding. After 40 years as my right hand at Burke Enterprises, Vivian understood the value of discretion. She had been the first to notice discrepancies in the company accounts, the first to question why contractors were being redirected from approved company projects to work on the Westlake property that Greg now claimed as his personal investment. "There's something not right with the new arrangements," she'd warned last year, setting in motion the quiet investigation that had culminated in tonight's dinner. I watched Greg signal for another drink, his confidence never wavering as he detailed his plans for expanding what he called his property portfolio in the coming year. Each word further sealed his fate. Each grandiose claim added to the evidence I had methodically compiled with Arthur's help. "The Burke name still carries significant weight in this town," Greg continued, completely missing the irony of his statement. "My latest project has attracted interest from investors as far as Singapore. My latest project. Not our company's project. Not Burke Holdings' investment." The distinction spoke volumes about how thoroughly he had convinced himself that marrying the founder's daughter had made him the heir to an empire he hadn't built. I nodded with practiced interest, mentally reviewing the documentation Arthur and I had prepared for tomorrow's meeting. The forensic accounting reports tracing every dollar Greg had diverted from company accounts, the sworn statements from contractors who had been told to book their work on the Westlake renovation as personal services rather than corporate expenses, the damning email exchanges with his personal assistant planning the vow renewal ceremony that would, in his words, finally establish us as the face of Burke Enterprises without Eleanor's outdated influence. "Speaking of projects," I said, carefully setting down my fork, "I've been reviewing the Westlake renovation expenses. Fascinating how much the budget has expanded since the initial approval." Greg's smile remained fixed, but a muscle twitched near his eye, the tell he'd never managed to eliminate despite years of practicing his boardroom face. "Just ensuring we create something truly spectacular," he replied smoothly. "Quality requires investment." I nodded thoughtfully. Charles always said the same thing. That's why he established such rigorous approval processes for budget expansions. Processes that, oddly enough, don't seem to have been followed for the East Wing. Additions. The flash of alarm that crossed his features was quickly masked, but not quickly enough. In the world of high-stakes business that Charles and I had navigated for decades, I had learned to read micro-expressions like others read financial statements. Greg reached for his wine glass, buying himself a moment to compose his response. Eleanor, you know how these historical renovations go. Unpredictable circumstances require flexible decision-making. The board gave me discretionary authority precisely for such situations. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Another lie to add to the growing collection. The board, meaning myself as majority shareholder, along with 4 long-standing company directors, had authorized no such thing. In fact, at tomorrow's emergency session, those same directors would review evidence of how Greg had systematically circumvented company protocols, gradually positioning himself as the public face of Burke Enterprises, while marginalizing my daughter's role and eliminating mine entirely. The first sign had been subtle. My office relocated to the historic wing of headquarters, while Greg took over Charles's former space with its commanding views of the city skyline. Then came the gradual exclusion from key meetings, always, with plausible excuses about streamlining operations or protecting me from unnecessary stress at my age. My age. As if my 7 decades were a liability rather than an asset of accumulated wisdom and experience. As if the silver in my hair somehow diminished the sharpness of my mind or my rightful place in the company Charles and I had built from. Nothing. The main courses arrived. Dover sole for me, Wagyu beef for Greg. He continued expounding on his business insights while I observed the confident way he wielded his knife, the practiced charm he turned on for the waiter, the subtle name-dropping of influential connections. 5 years ago, these same qualities had impressed me, had made me believe he might be a worthy addition to both our family and our company. I had welcomed him, had personally introduced him to our network of business associates, had shared stories of how Charles and I navigated the challenging early years of building Burke Enterprises, how thoroughly he had studied us, learning just enough about our methods to create a convincing imitation while understanding nothing of the principles that had guided our success. "Have you spoken with Madeline today?" I asked, deliberately, changing the subject. She seemed distressed when we had coffee yesterday. Another micro-expression flickered across his face, annoyance quickly masked by concern. "Just pre-event jitters," he said dismissively. "You know how she gets about these social functions." But I did know my daughter far better than Greg ever would. I recognized the growing unhappiness behind her carefully maintained social media presence, noticed how her natural vivacity had gradually dimmed under Greg's constant guidance about her appearance, her conversational topics, her role as his wife. Last week, she had mentioned almost casually that Greg thought it best if she stepped back from her position as Burke's community relations director, a role she had excelled in for years before their marriage. "He thinks it would be better if I focus on supporting his new ventures," she'd said, her eyes not quite meeting mine. "Besides, he's worried that people might think I only have the job because of our family connection." The irony of that statement, coming from a man who had leveraged that very family connection to build his entire career, had been nearly unbearable. A young couple entered the restaurant, their genuine affection evident in the way they leaned toward each other, their conversation animated and interspersed with laughter. Watching them, I felt a pang of nostalgia for the early days with Charles, when we'd stayed up late sketching plans for our first development, energized by shared dreams and mutual respect. How different from the calculated partnership I now observed across the table, where my son-in-law checked his watch again, his attention clearly divided between our dinner and whatever awaited him afterward. Probably another meeting with Veronica Hayes, the event planner who had texted him yesterday about the EW problem, Eleanor Williams problem, that needed to be handled delicately to ensure I didn't create complications for the upcoming ceremony. "The Sullivan contract finalizes tomorrow," Greg mentioned, smoothly transitioning to another business topic. "Largest development deal in the company's history." "My company's history," I mentally corrected, taking another sip of wine to hide my expression. The Sullivan contract, a lucrative downtown redevelopment project, had indeed been Burke Enterprises' most significant recent achievement, though not in the way Greg portrayed it. What he didn't know was that Arthur and I had already spoken with the Sullivan Group executives, clarifying certain misrepresentations Greg had made about property ownership and available capital. Their revised contract would be presented at tomorrow's board meeting, addressed to me as controlling shareholder, rather than to Greg as the self-proclaimed head of Burke Development Initiatives. The restaurant had filled with Westbrook's elite. I recognized the mayor at a corner table, a prominent surgeon dining with what appeared to be potential donors, several of Charles's old friends from the Chamber of Commerce. Many nodded respectfully in my direction, a subtle acknowledgement of my standing in a community where the Burke name still opened doors and commanded respect. Greg noticed these interactions, his expression tightening almost imperceptibly. Despite 5 years of strategic networking and publicity efforts, he remained Madeline Burke's husband, or Eleanor's son-in-law, to many of Westbrook's old guard. No amount of magazine profiles or charity gala appearances had fully established him as the rightful heir to Charles's legacy, a fact that clearly rankled. "I've been meaning to discuss the Riverside Heights property with you," I said casually, referring to one of our oldest family holdings, a waterfront estate Charles had purchased in the 1980s that had quadrupled in value. "There seems to be some confusion about the ownership structure." Greg's fork paused momentarily on its way to his mouth, another tell I cataloged mentally. "Just some routine refinancing paperwork," he replied with practiced ease. "Nothing to concern yourself with." The condescension in his tone was subtle but unmistakable, just as it had been when he'd explained to the contractor that Mother Eleanor doesn't need to be consulted on these technical details. Mother Eleanor. Never just Eleanor, never recognized. As co-founder of the company he was so eager to control, never acknowledged as the majority shareholder who could, with a single decision, remove him from the position he had maneuvered himself into. Dessert arrived. Creme brulee that I barely touched as Greg expanded on his plans for what he repeatedly called his development portfolio. With each sentence, each casual assumption of authority, each dismissive reference to outdated approaches needing modernization, he further sealed his fate. Tomorrow's board meeting had been carefully structured, each revelation timed for maximum impact, each piece of evidence meticulously verified by Arthur's legal team. First would come the financial audit showing systematic misallocation of company resources, then the documentation of misrepresentations to investors and contractors, and finally, most damning of all, the evidence of forgery on property transfer documents. By noon tomorrow, the security team would be escorting Greg from the offices he had so completely assumed were his to command. By evening, the locks would be changed on the Westlake mansion he had claimed as his crowning achievement. "I've taken the liberty of drafting some ideas for restructuring the company leadership," Greg mentioned as he signaled for the check, his tone suggesting he was doing me a favor. "Given your age, it seems prudent to consider succession planning that minimizes disruption." My age again, the convenient justification for my systematic exclusion. I smiled pleasantly, thinking of the detailed restructuring plans Arthur and I had already implemented, plans that would become apparent in less than 24 hours. "How thoughtful," I murmured, watching him sign the dinner bill with a flourish, charging it, no doubt, to the company account he treated as a personal expense fund. "I've been doing some planning along those lines myself." He nodded absently, clearly not registering any significance in my statement. In Greg's carefully constructed narrative, I was already a footnote. The founder's elderly widow, a relic to be respectfully but firmly moved aside to make way for his vision of Burke Enterprise's future. As we stepped outside into the cool evening air, the Burke building loomed above us, its distinctive architecture illuminated against the night sky. Once our company's first major construction project, now the most prestigious business address, in Westbrook Heights. Greg paused to admire it, his expression possessive. "Charles would be proud of how we've built on his foundation," he remarked, the "we" particularly galling given that he'd joined the company 30 years after the building's completion. I glanced at my watch. Tiffany, another gift from Charles. Noting that in exactly 14 hours, the board would convene in the penthouse conference room. 14 hours until the carefully constructed facade Greg had built came crashing down around him. "I'm sure tomorrow will bring some interesting developments," I replied mildly, accepting the car keys from the valet who greeted me by name, another small reminder of who truly belonged in Westbrook's business community. As Greg drove us back toward the Burke estate, the family home he and Madeline now occupied while I had downsized to the waterfront property that had been my favorite sanctuary, I gazed out at the city Charles and I had helped shape. Each prominent building, each revitalized neighborhood, each landmark development bore the invisible imprint of our shared vision and hard work. Greg might have temporarily positioned himself as the face of that legacy, might have convinced some newer investors and society figures of his central role, but tomorrow would bring a harsh reminder of reality. In business, as Charles always said, the appearance of power and actual power are sometimes very different things. Greg had mastered the appearance, surrounded himself with the trappings of success, and perhaps even convinced himself of the narrative he'd created. But actual power, the controlling interest in Burke Holdings, the legal ownership of every major property, the loyalty of long-term employees and business associates that remained firmly in my grasp. As we pulled up to the grand entrance of the Burke estate, lights gleamed welcomingly from windows that had witnessed 3 generations of family history. Greg checked his phone again before turning off the engine, no doubt responding to another message from Veronica about the vow renewal ceremony that would never take place. "Thanks for dinner," I said pleasantly as he came around to open my door, ever mindful of appearances. "I'm looking forward to tomorrow's meeting." He nodded, absently, clearly already mentally moving on to whatever awaited him inside. "Don't worry about attending if you're tired," he replied with that particular tone of solicitous condescension he had perfected. "I can fill you in on any important developments later." I smiled and patted his arm gently, enjoying the private irony. "Oh, I wouldn't miss tomorrow's meeting for anything," I assured him. "In fact, I have a feeling it will be quite memorable." Morning light filtered through the plantation shutters of my waterfront cottage, painting golden stripes across the antique desk where I sat reviewing the final documentation Arthur had delivered yesterday. Outside, Westbrook Lake shimmered peacefully, its surface occasionally broken by early kayakers enjoying the calm waters. This tranquil setting had become my sanctuary since downsizing from the main Burke estate, a move Greg had subtly engineered 2 years ago, presenting it as a thoughtful consideration for my comfort rather than the strategic sidelining it actually was. I traced my fingers across the embossed Burke Enterprises logo on the folder, remembering the night Charles and I had finalized the design, celebrating with cheap champagne in our first tiny apartment long before success found us. The cottage phone rang. Few people had this number, a deliberate choice to maintain my privacy. "Eleanor, it's Arthur. Just confirming you're still planning to attend in person?" His voice carried the precise, measured tone of 40 years in corporate law, though I could detect the underlying current of anticipation. "Absolutely," I replied, glancing at the elegant Cartier watch Charles had given me on our 30th anniversary. "I'll be arriving at 10:30, slightly before the official start. Has anything changed overnight?" Arthur cleared his throat, a habit that preceded his most serious communications. "Gregory called this morning requesting a private meeting before the board convenes. Apparently, he has some significant restructuring, Proposals he wishes to discuss without, as he put it, causing you undue stress. The audacity was almost admirable. Even now, hours before his carefully constructed house of cards would collapse, Greg was still maneuvering, still assuming his charm and business school jargon would overcome my decades of experience. Let him wait in the small conference room, I decided. Make sure Vivian has everything ready in the main boardroom exactly as we discussed. After disconnecting, I moved to my bedroom to dress with particular care. Today wasn't just about business, it was about reclaiming narrative, both corporate and personal. I selected a tailored Chanel suit in deep burgundy, a power color Charles-y. Always said brought out the determination in my eyes. No pastels or floral prints today. Nothing that would reinforce Greg's perception of me as the elderly matriarch to be humored and marginalized. The pearls Charles had given me on our first profitable year went around my neck, their weight familiar and reassuring. As I applied my makeup with practiced precision, I studied the face reflected back at me. The silver hair Greg considered a liability, the fine lines earned through years of business negotiations and family celebrations, the clear eyes that had seen through countless bluffs across boardroom tables. Age hadn't diminished me. It had distilled me to my essence. My phone chimed with a message from Madeline. "Dad would be proud of you today." My throat tightened unexpectedly. I hadn't told her everything, not yet. But as the company's legal counsel, she had seen enough of the documentation to understand the gravity of today's meeting. Another chime followed. "I'm sorry I didn't see it sooner." No further explanation needed. We both knew what it encompassed. Greg's systematic campaign to isolate me from the company Charles and I had built, his gradual repositioning of himself as the visionary behind Burke Enterprises' success, his dismissive treatment of my daughter's own considerable business acumen. The subtle manipulation had been masterful in its way, each individual action seemingly thoughtful or logical, while the cumulative effect stripped away my authority and Madeline's confidence. But Greg had miscalculated fundamentally in believing that age equaled vulnerability, or that my temporary silence signaled acceptance. The drive into downtown Westbrook took me past developments that charted the history of Burke Enterprises. The Riverside renovation that had revitalized the city's downtown in the 1990s, the mixed-use complex that had won urban planning awards, the historic theater Charles had insisted on preserving when other developers wanted it demolished for parking. Each project represented not just business decisions but values, our belief that development should enhance communities, that profit and principle could coexist, that legacy meant more than just accumulating wealth. These were the principles. Greg had never truly understood, seeing only the impressive balance sheets without comprehending what had created them. His vision extended only to his own advancement, his strategies focused on appearance rather than substance. The ultimate irony was that in his rush to claim Charles's legacy, he had violated its most fundamental tenets. The Burke building dominated. The city skyline, its distinctive architecture immediately recognizable even among newer, taller structures. The underground parking reserved my space. Founder Eleanor Burke. One of the few battles I had chosen to fight when Greg began his systematic rebranding efforts. The security guard nodded respectfully as I entered. His, "Good morning, Mrs. Burke." A small reminder that some institutional memories ran deeper than Greg's recent influence. The private elevator, another small territory I had maintained, carried me directly to the executive floor where Vivian waited, elegant as always in her trademark black suit, tablet in hand. "Everything is prepared," she confirmed, falling into step beside me. "Arthur has the documentation organized according to your instructions. The board members arrived 15 minutes ago and are being served refreshments." She lowered her voice, slightly. "Gregory is waiting in the side conference room as requested. He seems impatient." I allowed myself a small smile. 35 years managing this company, and I've never once started a board meeting late. He can practice the virtue of patience for once. Vivian's answering smile held decades of shared understanding. Like me, she had witnessed Greg's calculated ascension, had been gradually relegated to increasingly ceremonial roles despite her unmatched institutional knowledge. Today would be a reckoning for both of us. The small conference room door was ajar, revealing Greg pacing with nervous energy, his tailored suit unable to disguise the tension in his shoulders. He turned at my approach, his practiced smile sliding into place with professional ease. "Eleanor, I was hoping to catch you before the meeting." He gestured to the documents spread across the table. "I've prepared some proposals I think you'll find interesting. A comprehensive succession plan that protects your interests while streamlining our operational structure." I gazed at the presentation materials, noting the subtle rebranding already. Evident in the letterhead, Burke Enterprises, a legacy renewed, with Greg's name prominently featured. "How thoughtful," I replied, deliberately echoing my response from last night. "But I believe the board is waiting. We can address your proposals during the meeting." A flash of annoyance crossed his features before he recovered his composure. "Actually, I thought it might be better to discuss these privately first. Some of these transitions can be emotionally complex for founders. I wanted to ensure you felt comfortable with the direction before presenting to the full board." The condescension was breathtaking, positioning himself as the considerate protector while essentially asking me to rubber stamp my own removal. "I've found that in business, transparency serves everyone best," I replied calmly. "The boardroom seems the appropriate venue for discussing Burke Enterprises' future, don't you think?" Without waiting for his response, I turned toward the main conference room, leaving him to gather his materials and follow. The boardroom fell silent as I entered, the familiar faces of our long-standing directors showing varying degrees of curiosity and concern. These were people who had worked alongside Charles and me for decades. Walter Chen from our early financing days, Patricia Montgomery, who had handled our legal affairs before Madeline joined the firm, Thomas Blackwell, who had been our first major investor when Burke Enterprises was just an ambitious idea. They knew me not as Greg's elderly mother-in-law, but as the co-architect of the company whose boardroom table we now surrounded. Madeline sat quietly in her position as legal counsel, her expression carefully neutral though her eyes met mine, briefly with unmistakable support. "Thank you all for accommodating this special session," I began, taking my seat at the head of the table, the position Charles had occupied for 30 years and that I had maintained after his passing, despite Greg's not-so-subtle suggestions about moving to an honorary chairperson role. Greg settled into his place midway down the table, his earlier confidence noticeably tempered by my refusal to engage with his private proposals. Arthur distributed folders to each board member, the Burke Enterprises logo embossed in gold on heavy cream stock, a deliberate choice that harkened back to our original company materials rather than the sleek, modernized branding Greg had implemented. "Before we begin, I want to thank each of you for your service to this company," I continued. "Some of you have been with us since Charles first shared his vision for transforming Westbrook's downtown. Others joined as we expanded into new markets. All of you have contributed to building a legacy based on integrity, community investment, and sustainable growth." My gaze moved deliberately around the table, resting briefly on Greg, whose expression had shifted from mild impatience to growing wariness. Those founding principles remain as relevant today as they were 40 years ago, which brings us to the purpose of today's meeting. Arthur rose at my nod, his tall frame commanding immediate attention. Board members have before them the results of a comprehensive audit of Burke Enterprises' operations over the past 5 years, with particular focus on property management, financial reporting, and project authorization procedures. Greg shifted in his chair, his earlier confidence visibly evaporating as he flipped open the folder and began scanning its contents. The room remained silent except for the soft sound of turning pages as each director reviewed the meticulously compiled evidence. Financial records showing systematic diversion of company resources to projects primarily benefiting Greg's personal brand. Documentation of misrepresentations to investors regarding ownership and control of key properties. Emails revealing how he had deliberately circumvented established approval processes. These findings reveal a pattern of concerning behaviors, Arthur continued, his legal training evident in his precise, measured delivery. Most troubling are the apparent discrepancies in property ownership representations, particularly regarding the Westlake historical renovation, the Riverside Heights development, and the lakefront commercial complex. Greg's face had paled considerably, his eyes darting between the documentation and my composed expression at the head of the table. I maintained deliberate eye contact, allowing him to see not anger, but disappointment. The same expression Charles would have worn had he witnessed how thoroughly his son-in-law had betrayed our trust. These are administrative technicalities, Greg finally interjected, his voice maintaining its professional smoothness though lacking its usual confidence. In the interest of operational efficiency, certain processes were streamlined. Nothing here represents any substantive violation of company protocol. Patricia Montgomery, our longest-serving board member, removed her reading glasses slowly. Streamlined processes don't typically involve representing yourself as the owner of properties held by the Burke Family Trust, she observed, her tone mild, but her implication devastating. Nor do they generally include redirecting company resources to personal projects without board approval. The meeting proceeded methodically through each category of evidence, the timeline Arthur and I had carefully constructed, revealing the gradual escalation of Greg's unauthorized activities. From initial small misrepresentations about his role in project developments to the recent forgery of transfer documents for the Westlake property, the pattern was undeniable. Through it all, I maintained my composed silence, allowing the evidence to speak for itself while observing Greg's increasingly desperate attempts to reframe the narrative. This selective presentation omits critical context, he insisted, his polished veneer beginning to crack under pressure. Everything I've done has been to modernize Burke Enterprises and position us for future growth. Eleanor herself has been gradually stepping back from day-to-day operations, a natural transition she and I have discussed extensively. All eyes turned to me, waiting for my response to this blatant mischaracterization. I smiled slightly, appreciating the opening he had unwittingly provided. That brings us to the second purpose of today's meeting, I said, nodding to Arthur, who distributed another set of documents. What you now have before you is the current ownership and control structure of Burke Enterprises, the Burke Family Trust, and all associated property holdings. Greg frantically flipped through the pages, his expression shifting from confusion to disbelief to something approaching panic as the reality of his situation became clear. As you'll note, controlling interest in all Burke Enterprises and properties remains with me as trustee, with secondary oversight shared between Madeline Burke as legal counsel and the board of directors as fiduciary representatives. The implications settled over the room like a slowly descending weight. Every property Greg had claimed in media interviews, every development he had presented as his visionary achievement, every asset he had leveraged for his personal advancement, all remained firmly under my legal control. The administrative technicalities he had dismissed represented not just ethical violations, but potentially criminal misrepresentation. Thomas Blackwell, who had remained silent throughout most of the presentation, finally spoke. These discrepancies appear to go well beyond operational streamlining, Gregory. They suggest a deliberate pattern of misrepresentation to investors, financial institutions, and the public. Greg's desperate gaze found Madeline, clearly hoping for some intervention from his wife, but her expression remained professionally neutral. As company counsel, she had sworn an ethical obligation to the organization that transcended even marital loyalty. This is a coordinated attempt to undermine my position, Greg declared, abandoning his usual strategic calm for increasingly transparent desperation. I've devoted 5 years to modernizing this company, to building on Charles's foundation and creating a sustainable future. These allegations are a mischaracterization of necessary business decisions made with the company's best interests at heart. The boardroom fell silent as I finally rose from my seat, commanding attention without raising my voice, a skill Charles had always admired. Gregory, when Charles and I founded this company, we established certain principles that were non-negotiable. First among them was integrity, in our dealings with clients, with communities, and with each other. Second was respect, for the legacy we were building, for the people who helped build it, and for the responsibilities that came with success. I moved slowly around the table, each measured step emphasizing the gravity of the moment. The documentation before this board shows systematic violations of both principles, not mistakes or oversights, but calculated decisions to misrepresent, to mislead, and ultimately to appropriate what was never yours to claim. I stopped directly beside his chair, close enough to see the slight tremor in his hands as he frantically searched the documents for some loophole, some technicality that might salvage his position. You saw my age as a weakness to be exploited rather than experience to be respected. You viewed the Burke legacy as a brand to be leveraged rather than values to be upheld. Most grievously, you treated my daughter not as a partner with her own valuable contributions, but as a convenient access point to the power you coveted. The room remained utterly silent, the other board members recognizing the rarity of such direct confrontation from someone known for diplomatic leadership. The Burke name, I continued, returning to my seat at the head of the table, has stood for integrity in this community for 40 years. That reputation was not built through press releases or magazine profiles, but through consistent actions aligned with clear values. It cannot and will not be compromised by anyone, regardless of their position or connection to this family. I nodded to Arthur, who distributed the final set of documents, these bearing the formal letterhead of the Burke Family Trust. The board now has before it a proposed restructuring of Burke Enterprises leadership, effective immediately upon approval. Greg frantically scanned the document, his face draining of color as he absorbed the comprehensive dismantling of his position. The restructuring removed him not just from key decision-making authority, but from the company entirely, while reinstating Madeline to her rightful position as executive vice president and clarifying my continuing role as chairperson and majority shareholder. More devastating still was the second section detailing the immediate transfer of residence requirements. He would vacate the Burke family estate within 30 days and surrender all access credentials to company properties, including the Westlake mansion he had so proudly claimed as his crowning achievement. "This is outrageous," he finally managed, his carefully cultivated professional demeanor completely abandoned. "You can't possibly expect the board to approve this vindictive overreaction to minor procedural differences. I've increased company valuation by 30% in 5 years. I've modernized operations, expanded our market presence, and created a sustainable growth model that..." Walter Chen, our normally reserved financial director, gently interrupted. "Actually, Gregory, our analysis suggests that Burke Enterprises' recent growth aligns with market trends for the sector. The operational changes you've implemented show negligible impact on overall performance metrics when controlled for external economic factors." One by one, the board members who had witnessed the company's evolution from startup to industry leader voiced their support for the restructuring plan. Each spoke not from personal loyalty to me, but from recognition of the documented violations of company principles and procedures. Throughout their deliberations, I maintained a composed silence, allowing the governance process Charles and I had established decades ago to function as intended. Greg's increasingly desperate objections fell on unsympathetic ears, his carefully cultivated alliances proving insufficient against the weight of documented evidence. The formal vote, when it came, was unanimous. Walter Chen, as finance chair, made the final declaration. "The board hereby approves the leadership restructuring, as presented, effective immediately." Gregory Williams is removed from all positions within Burke Enterprises and its subsidiaries. Access to company resources, properties, and information systems will be terminated as of 5 p.m. today. The clinical finality of the statement hung in the air as Greg sat motionless, the magnitude of his fall becoming increasingly apparent with each passing moment. His empire, or rather, the empire he had attempted to claim, had evaporated in a single morning meeting. As the board members began gathering their materials, I addressed them one final time. Thank you for your service to this company today, and always. Burke Enterprises will continue its commitment to responsible development and community investment under the restored leadership structure. Arthur will circulate transition details this afternoon. The meeting adjourned with quiet efficiency, board members filing out with subdued professionalism despite the dramatic proceedings they had just witnessed. Madeline remained seated, her expression unreadable as she watched her husband struggle to process the comprehensive dismantling of his professional identity. When only Greg, Madeline, Arthur, and I remained, I finally addressed my son-in-law directly. Security will escort you to collect personal items from your office. Company devices and materials will remain on premises for review. The locks at the Burke estate will be changed by this evening. The deliberate calmness of my tone seemed to finally penetrate his shock. You planned this entire thing, he said, disbelief giving way to dawning comprehension. All these months while I thought, you were gradually stepping back. You were actually documenting everything, just waiting for the right moment. I gathered my materials unhurriedly, the weight of the pearls around my neck a comforting reminder of how much Charles and I had already overcome in building our legacy. You made a fundamental miscalculation, Gregory. You saw my age as a liability, when it was actually my greatest asset. 40 years in business teaches you patience, the understanding that sometimes the most effective response isn't immediate confrontation, but strategic preparation. I closed my portfolio with deliberate finality. It also teaches you to recognize the difference between those who build something lasting and those who merely wish to claim credit for others' achievements. His gaze shifted desperately to Madeline. You're allowing this? Your own husband publicly humiliated and discarded like some temporary employee? Madeline finally spoke, her voice steady despite the visible emotion behind her eyes. What I'm allowing is the company my parents built to continue operating according to the principles they established. What I'm preventing is the further misrepresentation of my family's legacy. She gathered her legal documents with practiced efficiency. We can discuss personal matters privately. This meeting concerned professional misconduct with legal implications that couldn't be ignored. Security appeared discreetly at the boardroom entrance. A necessary precaution Arthur had insisted upon given the magnitude of what had transpired. Greg stared at the uniformed officers in disbelief, the final confirmation that his carefully constructed reality had irrevocably shattered. You won't get away with this, he said, though the threat sounded hollow even to his own ears. The media are investors. Everyone knows my role in Burke's recent success. This vindictive power play will damage the company far more than any supposed violations you've manufactured. I smiled slightly, appreciating the opening for the final revelation I had reserved for this moment. Actually, Gregory, the business community has already been informed. Arthur has spent the morning briefing key stakeholders, investors, and media contacts regarding the leadership transition, presenting it not as a dramatic upheaval, but as a natural return to Burke Enterprises. Founding principles following concerning discoveries during routine governance review. The calculated precision of this approach, mirroring the very techniques Greg himself had used to gradually sideline me, was not lost on him. His expression collapsed into recognition of complete defeat as I continued. The Sullivan Group has already confirmed they'll proceed with the downtown development under the restored leadership structure. The Historical Preservation Society will announce this afternoon that the Westlake restoration will continue under original Burke Enterprises management, with appropriate credit for your contributions during the initial phase. Security stepped forward as Greg remained frozen in his chair, the comprehensive dismantling of his professional identity finally complete. "Mrs. Burke," the senior officer acknowledged respectfully, "we're ready to proceed whenever you give the word." I nodded, maintaining eye contact with Greg one final time. "You excluded me from a ceremony celebrating a marriage and home that existed only through my family's legacy. You dismissed decades of business experience as irrelevant because it came with silver hair and practical shoes. You mistook patience for weakness and institutional knowledge for outdated thinking." I gathered my belongings with unhurried dignity. Most importantly, you forgot the fundamental truth of legacy businesses. Appearance and reality are not the same thing. You had the appearance of control, while I maintained the reality of ownership. Today simply brings those two elements back into appropriate alignment. Without waiting for his response, I turned to leave the boardroom that had witnessed 4 decades of company history. The early struggles, the gradual successes, the inevitable setbacks, and now this necessary course correction. Vivian waited, outside, her composed efficiency masking the satisfaction I knew she felt at witnessing the restoration of proper order. "The Westlake property management team has been notified of the leadership transition," she confirmed as we walked toward my office. "The Historical Society representatives are particularly relieved. Apparently, Gregory had been pushing to modify several original architectural elements against preservation guidelines." A weight I hadn't fully acknowledged seemed to lift from my shoulders with each step away from the boardroom, as if the very act of reclaiming narrative control had physically lightened my burden. The views from the executive floor stretched across Westbrook's evolving skyline, a landscape Charles and I had helped shape through decades of thoughtful development. The Burke legacy wasn't confined to corporate balance sheets or property portfolios, but existed in the mixed-income housing developments that had revitalized struggling neighborhoods, in the preserved historical buildings that maintain the city's unique character, in the green spaces we had insisted on incorporating into every major project. These were the achievements Greg had never truly understood, fixated as he was on superficial markers of success. Madeline found me there an hour later, gazing out at the city while finalizing transition documentation with Arthur. Her eyes were red-rimmed, but her posture reflected the quiet strength that had always reminded me of Charles. "Security has completed the office transition," she reported professionally, though the slight tremor in her voice betrayed the personal toll of the morning's events. "Gregory has been escorted from the building. It has already restricted his system access." She hesitated briefly before adding, "He's asked me to meet him at the house this evening to discuss personal matters." I reached for my daughter's hand, momentarily setting aside the role of company chairperson for that of mother. "Business necessities and personal relationships exist in different spheres," I said gently. "What happened today was about protecting the company's integrity and future. What happens between you and Gregory is entirely separate, a decision only you can make based on your own values and circumstances." The wisdom of 46 years of marriage allowed me to recognize that corporate misconduct didn't automatically dictate the fate of personal commitments, however intertwined they might seem in the moment. Madeline nodded, visibly gathering herself. "The Sullivan Group representatives confirmed they'll meet with us tomorrow to finalize the contract under the original terms. They seemed relieved, actually. Apparently, Gregory had been pushing modifications that concerned their legal team." She straightened, professional demeanor returning as she continued updating me on immediate transition priorities. In her composed efficiency, I saw echoes of both Charles's strategic thinking and my own pragmatic approach to crisis management, qualities that would serve her well regardless of what personal decisions awaited her. By late afternoon, the immediate transitional tasks had been addressed. Security protocols updated, stakeholder communications distributed, project management transfers initiated. I gathered my things, suddenly aware of the emotional and physical toll the day's events had taken. "The car is waiting whenever you're ready," Vivian informed me. I've rescheduled tomorrow's non-essential appointments to give you some recovery time. Always perceptive, always 3 steps ahead, qualities Greg had foolishly dismissed when relegating her to increasingly ceremonial roles. Actually, I decided, have them bring the car around now. There's one more stop I need to make. Today. Vivian raised an eyebrow but asked no questions. Another quality I had always valued in our decades working together. 30 minutes later, my driver pulled up before the imposing facade of the Westlake Mansion, the historic property Greg had claimed as his crowning achievement, the signature restoration that featured prominently in his media profiles and industry interviews. The security guard, recognizing me immediately, waved us through without question. Another small reminder of institutional memory that transcended recent influence. The massive oak doors opened into the grand foyer where craftsmen had spent months restoring intricate plasterwork and original hardwood floors, all funded through Burke Enterprises accounts despite Greg's media representations of personal investment. I moved through spaces that held decades of personal history. The ballroom where Charles and I had hosted our 25th anniversary celebration, the library with built-in shelves he had designed himself, the garden terrace where we had planned the company's first major expansion while watching summer sunsets. Every corner held memories Greg had attempted to overwrite with his revisionist narrative of single-handed restoration. Howard Chen, the project manager who had overseen the restoration since its inception, appeared from the East Wing, surprise evident in his expression. "Mrs. Burke, we weren't expecting you today." His gaze darted nervously toward the staircase where workers were installing modern light fixtures that clashed dramatically with the home's historical character. Undoubtedly, another of Greg's visionary updates that prioritized contemporary trends over architectural integrity. "I'm just making a final inspection before we adjust some of the restoration priorities," I explained calmly. "There's been a leadership transition at Burke Enterprises today. Gregory Williams is no longer affiliated with the company or its projects." Howard's expression shifted from confusion to carefully masked relief, telling confirmation of how Greg's management style had affected those actually executing the work. "The Historical Society's original recommendations will be reinstated immediately," I continued. "Please halt any modernization efforts that conflict with preservation guidelines until you receive updated directives tomorrow." I continued through the mansion, mentally cataloging modifications to be reversed, original elements to be restored, historical integrity to be preserved. This wasn't about erasing Greg's contributions entirely. Several of his design choices genuinely enhanced the property's functionality while respecting its character, but about realigning the project with its original purpose, honoring Burke Enterprises' commitment to historical preservation rather than creating a showcase for one man's personal brand. In the master suite, the rooms Charles and I had once occupied during weekend retreats before his illness, Greg had installed ultra-modern fixtures and technology that transformed the space into something unrecognizable from its original design. Style magazines had featured the renovation as brilliantly blending historical grandeur with contemporary luxury, crediting Greg's unique vision for what was essentially an exercise in self-promotion at the expense of architectural integrity. I made a mental note to have Arthur contact those same publications with factual corrections about the property's ownership and management. As sunset painted the grand staircase in warm amber light, I completed my inspection and returned to the waiting car. The weight that had lifted during the board meeting settled again slightly, not from doubt about the necessary actions taken, but from recognition of the personal consequences still unfolding. Madeline would face difficult decisions about her marriage separate from the professional misconduct that had necessitated today's intervention. The company would navigate inevitable questions from the business community despite our careful communication strategy. The Burke legacy would endure, but not without weathering this necessary disruption. The drive back to my waterfront cottage provided time for reflection as Westbrook's evening lights began illuminating the deepening twilight. Greg's fundamental miscalculation had been seeing age as weakness rather than strength, dismissing experience as irrelevance rather than recognizing its value. In positioning me as an outdated figurehead to be respectfully but firmly sidelined, he had overlooked the decades of relationship building, strategic thinking, and institutional knowledge that provided the very foundation he had attempted to claim as his own creation. More personally, he had underestimated how thoroughly Charles and I had prepared for eventualities neither of us could specifically foresee. The Burke family trust structure, the carefully maintained controlling interest in company holdings, the meticulous documentation of property ownership, all represented Charles' determination that our life's work would remain protected regardless of future circumstances. "People will always want what we've built," he had said while finalizing the trust documents during his illness. "Make sure they have to earn it through demonstrated commitment to what it stands for, not just claim it through proximity or manipulation." As my driver turned down the private lane leading to the lakefront cottage, my phone chimed with a message from Arthur. "Transition proceeding smoothly. Media statement distributed as planned. Security confirms GT vacated office without incident." The clinical efficiency of these updates belied the human drama they represented. A career derailed, a marriage in crisis, a company at inflection point. Yet the message that followed from Madeline carried more personal significance. Meeting. "G at the house now. Whatever happens next, thank you for protecting what Dad built. What you both built." The cottage welcomed me with familiar comfort, its modest proportions and lakefront views representing not the downsizing Greg had engineered, but the sanctuary Charles had insisted on including in our estate planning. "You'll need somewhere that's just yours," he had said, recognizing before I did how our main residence might someday become complicated territory. The wall of windows facing the water reflected evening lights from across the lake, creating the illusion of stars both above and below the horizon line. I moved through evening routines with practiced ease, changing from business attire to comfortable clothes, preparing a simple dinner, pouring a single glass of the Cabernet Charles and I had discovered on our 30th anniversary trip. The party. Day's events would have far-reaching consequences beyond the immediate corporate restructuring. Relationships altered, perceptions shifted, futures redirected. Yet beneath the inevitable complexities lay a fundamental simplicity. Principles. Upheld, legacy protected, truth restored. My phone chimed again. Vivian confirming tomorrow's adjusted schedule. Arthur reporting that the Sullivan Group had already signed the revised contract under Burke Enterprises' proper leadership structure. Thomas Blackwell expressing his admiration for how the situation had been handled. The business machinery continued its forward momentum, adapting to the day's recalibration with professional efficiency. No message from Madeline yet. Her personal reckoning would unfold on its own timeline, separate from corporate considerations yet inevitably influenced by them. As night settled fully over the lake, I found myself in Charles's study, the one room I had recreated exactly from the main estate when moving to the cottage. His books lined the walls. His favorite leather chair still held the slight indentation. From years of use, his collection of architectural models from significant Burke projects created a timeline of our shared professional journey. I settled into his chair, allowing memories to surface naturally. His laugh during our first major contract signing, his steady presence during inevitable market downturns, his unwavering belief that what we built together would outlast both of us. "Legacy isn't just what you leave behind," he had said during those final difficult months, "but who carries it forward?" At the time, we had both assumed that meant Madeline and eventually Greg. That family connection would naturally translate to compatible values and vision. Today had proven the flaw in that assumption. Shared DNA or marital ties provided no guarantee of shared principles. Legacy required not just inheritance but stewardship, not just claiming a name but embodying its essential meaning. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, media inquiries to manage, investor relations to maintain, project transitions to oversee. Madeline would need support navigating her personal decisions independent of the professional necessities that had forced today's actions. The company would require steady leadership through this transition period, reinforcing that Burke Enterprises' fundamental strengths transcended any individual's contribution. But tonight, in the quiet of Charles's study, surrounded by tangible reminders of all we had built together, I allowed myself a moment of simple satisfaction. The Burke legacy remained intact, its foundation solid despite recent attempts to reconstruct it according to one man's ambitions. Age had proven not a liability, but an asset, providing the patience to gather evidence methodically, the wisdom to recognize familiar patterns of manipulation, the perspective to distinguish between immediate confrontation and strategic response. Most satisfying of all was the knowledge that Greg's fundamental miscalculation, dismissing me as an outdated relic while positioning himself as the company's modern savior, had ultimately caused his downfall. In treating my silver hair and sensible shoes as indicators of irrelevance, he had overlooked the decades of experience, relationship building, and strategic thinking they represented. By excluding me from a ceremony celebrating a marriage and home that existed only through my family's legacy, he had triggered the very reckoning he had worked so diligently to prevent. The lakefront cottage windows reflected my image against the darkness outside. Silver hair, lined face, eyes still sharp with the determination Charles had always admired. Not an elderly liability to be managed and marginalized, but a formidable guardian of principles worth protecting. Not just Charles, Burke's widow, but Eleanor Burke, co-founder and rightful steward of everything we had built together. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges and decisions. But tonight, watching moonlight create silver pathways across the lake Charles and I had once swum in during younger days, I allowed myself to simply be a woman who had built something lasting, protected something valuable, and reminded everyone that underestimating someone based on their age might well be the most expensive mistake a person could make. Morning sunlight streamed through the stained glass panels of St. Andrew's Episcopal Church, casting prismatic patterns across the worn wooden pews where I sat alone, finding a moment of peace before the day's inevitable confrontations. The church had stood in downtown Westbrook for over a century, its quiet dignity a stark contrast to the ultra-modern architecture Greg preferred for Burke developments. Charles and I had been married here 46 years ago, had christened Madeline here, had said our final goodbyes to Charles in this very sanctuary. Greg had once dismissed it as architecturally irrelevant, another example of his fundamental misunderstanding of what truly constituted lasting value. The gentle footsteps approaching from the side chapel belonged to Reverend Margaret, who had known our family for decades. Her silver hair caught the rainbow light as she settled beside me, respectful of my contemplative silence before speaking. "I was surprised to see you this morning, Eleanor. Isn't today the quarterly board meeting?" Her knowledge of my schedule was typical of someone who had counseled 3 generations of Burkes through celebrations and crises alike. "It is," I confirmed, smoothing non-existent wrinkles from my tailored navy suit. "But some decisions require more than business strategy. I needed perspective." She nodded, understanding without requiring further explanation. Unlike Greg, who viewed spiritual matters as quaint anachronisms, Margaret recognized that ethical frameworks transcended quarterly reports and profit margins. "Madeline called me yesterday," she said after a respectful pause. "She seemed troubled about decisions facing your family." Of course, Madeline would seek Margaret's counsel. Their relationship had deepened after Charles's funeral when Margaret had provided the compassionate guidance my grief-stricken daughter needed. I sighed, feeling the weight of competing responsibilities. Protecting the company Charles and I had built, supporting Madeline through marital disruption, maintaining my own integrity throughout a conflict I had neither sought nor desired. "Today I must take actions that will cause pain," I admitted. "Necessary pain, but pain nonetheless." Margaret's weathered hands folded over mine, her touch expressing what platitudes could not. "You know," she said thoughtfully, "I've always Admired how you and Charles built your company on principles, not just profit. That legacy is worth protecting. The simple validation steadied me, reinforcing what I already knew but needed to hear from someone unconnected to corporate politics. I stood, gathering my leather portfolio, the one Charles had given me on our 30th anniversary, embossed with both our initials. "Thank you, Margaret, for everything." She smiled, understanding that my gratitude encompassed far more than this moment of counsel. "Remember, Eleanor, wisdom and kindness aren't mutually exclusive, even in difficult moments." Her words accompanied me as I walked through Founders Park toward Burke headquarters, another example of our commitment to public spaces within commercial developments. Greg had initially proposed eliminating the green space to expand the tower's footprint, unable to quantify the value of preserving urban nature. Charles had insisted that profit and principle could coexist, that development should enhance community life, rather than simply extract value from it. Every bench, every carefully selected tree, every winding pathway reflected intentional design choices that transcended quarterly earnings expectations. The security guard at Burke Tower, Samuel, whose college education had been funded through the Burke Scholarship Program, greeted me with genuine warmth. "Beautiful morning, Mrs. Burke." His recognition wasn't mere professional courtesy but personal connection, the type of institutional relationship Greg dismissed as inefficient sentimentality rather than valuable social capital. I smiled, noting the fresh photograph on his security desk, his daughter in graduation regalia. "Sarah finished her master's program?" His proud nod confirmed what the Burke Scholarship Committee had recognized 7 years ago: potential requiring only opportunity to flourish. My private elevator opened directly into the executive floor where Diane, my administrative director for 27 years, waited with characteristic efficiency. Her precisely organized portfolio contained everything required for the day's confrontation: documentation Arthur had prepared, financial analyses Howard had compiled, witness statements Thomas had gathered. But beyond these tangible preparations, Diane's presence represented something Greg had never fully appreciated: institutional memory, the accumulated wisdom of decades serving the company's mission. "The board members have begun arriving," she reported, her calm professionalism masking what I knew was personal investment in today's outcome. "Gregory arrived 15 minutes ago and is in his office." Arthur suggested allowing board members to review documentation individually before the formal meeting begins. The boardroom, still bearing the 12-foot mahogany table Charles had commissioned from local craftsmen during our first profitable year, embodied Burke Enterprises' institutional history. Each chair represented decades of deliberation, crisis management, strategic planning, and measured growth. The painting dominating the eastern wall, a commissioned landscape of Westbrook's original downtown, served as visual reminder of our company's foundational commitment to the community's authentic character. Greg had repeatedly suggested replacing it with something more contemporary, failing to recognize its symbolic importance in maintaining connection between past decisions and future directions. Walter Chen, our longest-serving board member, approached as I settled documentation at my customary position. His formal demeanor couldn't quite conceal genuine concern. "Eleanor, I've reviewed Arthur's preliminary materials. The situation appears consequential." His characteristic understatement brought unexpected comfort. Walter had witnessed Burke Enterprises' weather recessions, market disruptions, and leadership transitions, providing perspective when younger executives panicked at temporary setbacks. "Indeed," I acknowledged, appreciating his measured assessment, "but necessary for preserving what truly matters." He nodded, understanding that my reference transcended financial considerations. Walter had known Charles since their university days, had witnessed our struggle building the company from nothing, had supported our commitment to ethical development when competitors prioritized quick profits. Board members filtered in gradually, each receiving individual documentation portfolios from Arthur, who maintained professional composure despite the dramatic nature of what would unfold. Patricia Montgomery, our governance expert, studied the materials with growing concern, occasionally glancing toward Greg's empty chair with narrowed eyes. Thomas Blackwell, representing our original investor coalition, methodically annotated key sections, his expression growing increasingly troubled. Victoria Winters, our newest member recruited for her urban planning expertise, appeared visibly disturbed by what she was discovering about the man who had personally championed her board appointment. The boardroom atmosphere thickened with unspoken tension, as understanding rippled through these seasoned executives. They recognized the significance of what lay before them, not merely corporate malfeasance, but betrayal of founding principles. Not just procedural violations, but fundamental breaches of trust. Through methodical documentation rather than emotional confrontation, I had created inescapable accountability for actions Greg had assumed would remain undetected, or, if discovered, easily explained away through his practiced charm. Madeline arrived last, her professional composure as company counsel maintained despite the personal stakes involved. Our eyes met briefly, hers conveying determination mingled with unmistakable pain. The courage required to maintain ethical obligations despite marital loyalty showcased a strength I had always recognized in my daughter, but that Greg had systematically undermined through subtle diminishment of her professional contributions. She took her designated place at the table's far end, arranging legal references with practiced efficiency, while steadfastly avoiding the empty chair where her husband would soon experience the consequences of his calculated deceptions. When Greg finally entered, 10 minutes after the scheduled start time, a habitual power move to emphasize his perceived importance, his confident stride faltered momentarily upon registering the unusual atmosphere. His recovery was immediate, practiced smile sliding into place as he approached his designated seat. "Apologies for the delay," he announced with that particular tone combining authority with superficial contrition. The Sullivan Group called, with some last-minute concerns about the downtown development. Nothing we can't handle with appropriate reassurance. The irony of his statement, considering what was about to unfold regarding that very development, was not lost on board members already briefed on his misrepresentations to the Sullivan Group about property ownership. "Thank you all for accommodating this special session," I began, my voice steady despite the gravity of what would follow. "Before we proceed with today's agenda, I must address significant concerns that have emerged regarding Burke Enterprises' operational integrity." Greg's expression shifted subtly, confusion followed by momentary alarm before his professional mask reasserted itself. His gaze darted toward Madeline, clearly seeking some explanation or warning, but her attention remained fixed on the documentation before her, her ethical obligations as company counsel transcending personal loyalty. Arthur rose at my nod, his tall frame commanding immediate attention. Board members have before them documentation outlining systematic operational irregularities identified during routine compliance review. His legal training evident in precise language that established facts without inflammatory characterization. These materials detail 3 primary areas of concern: financial reporting discrepancies regarding property development expenses, misrepresentation of ownership interests to external stakeholders, and unauthorized modification of established approval procedures for capital expenditures. Greg's practiced confidence visibly faltered as he scanned the comprehensive evidence, assembled through months of methodical investigation. Each section revealed another aspect of his systematic campaign to appropriate control, redirect resources, and position himself as the visionary force behind Burke Enterprises while marginalizing those who had actually built it. His attempts to interject were gently but firmly redirected by Walter, who insisted on reviewing complete documentation before entertaining explanatory comments. "Of particular concern," Arthur continued, "are representations made to the Sullivan Group regarding ownership and control of the Westlake Historical Property and Riverside Heights development. Documentation indicates that Gregory Williams repeatedly presented himself as primary owner and controlling authority for properties legally held by the Burke Family Trust, with Eleanor Burke as sole trustee and signatory authority. The evidence was damning in its specificity: emails, meeting transcripts, promotional materials, and legal correspondence demonstrating deliberate misrepresentation rather than occasional overstatement or administrative oversight. Greg's composure cracked further as Patricia methodically directed attention to Section 14, financial documentation revealing how renovation expenses for the Westlake mansion had been deliberately classified under personal investment rather than accurately recorded as Burke Enterprises expenditures. These accounting classifications directly contradict established company procedures for historical property renovations, she noted, her governance expertise lending particular weight to the observation. Moreover, they appear designed to create public perception of personal investment that misrepresents actual funding sources and ownership structures. These are administrative technicalities, Greg finally interjected, his voice maintaining superficial confidence though lacking its usual authoritative resonance. In streamlining operational procedures to improve efficiency, some traditional classification protocols were modified. Nothing here represents substantive impropriety, merely procedural adjustments to accommodate modern business practices. His defense, framing ethical violations as modernization initiatives, might have proven effective with less experienced executives or those lacking comprehensive understanding of Burke Enterprises' operational history. But this carefully selected board recognized the fundamental distinction between procedural flexibility and deliberate misrepresentation. Thomas Blackwell, who had remained silent throughout initial presentations, finally spoke with the measured authority of someone who had witnessed Burke Enterprises' evolution from ambitious startup to industry leader. Gregory, I've reviewed the Sullivan Group contract documentation with particular attention to ownership representations. These aren't procedural adjustments, but fundamental mischaracterizations of who controls these properties. You've repeatedly presented yourself as principal owner and final authority for assets that have never been under your legal control. The methodical dismantling of Greg's carefully constructed narrative continued as each board member addressed specific aspects of the documented violations. Victoria highlighted the pattern of circumventing established community engagement protocols for urban developments, shortcuts that undermined Burke Enterprises' long-standing commitment to collaborative planning. Walter detailed financial implications of misrepresenting ownership to potential investors and development partners. Patricia emphasized governance violations evident in unilateral decision-making regarding historically protected properties. Throughout these presentations, I maintained deliberate silence, allowing documented evidence rather than personal grievance to shape board members' understanding. Greg's increasingly desperate explanations grew less coherent as the comprehensive nature of the investigation became apparent. His attempts to reframe violations as modernization initiatives, to characterize deception as miscommunication, to position ethical breaches as administrative efficiency, found no purchase with board members who recognized the fundamental breach of trust underlying his actions. When all evidence had been methodically presented, I finally addressed the situation directly. Burke Enterprises was founded on principles transcending profit margins. Charles believed that development should enhance communities, that success required integrity in all dealings, that lasting legacy demanded consistent ethical practice. The mention of Charles's name visibly affected board members who had witnessed his leadership firsthand. The documentation before you demonstrates systematic violation of these foundational principles through deliberate misrepresentation, unauthorized appropriation of resources, and fundamental breach of fiduciary responsibility. Greg's desperation manifested in increasingly transparent attempts to reframe the narrative. This selective presentation omits crucial context, he insisted, abandoning his usual strategic calm for increasingly evident panic. Every decision was made with the company's best interests in mind. Eleanor has been gradually reducing her operational involvement, a natural transition process she and I have discussed extensively. These materials represent isolated incidents, taken out of context rather than the comprehensive modernization strategy we've been implementing. His reference to private conversations that had never occurred, another attempt to create alternative reality through confident assertion, provided perfect opening for the final phase of today's necessary intervention. That brings us to the second purpose of today's meeting, I said, nodding to Arthur, who distributed the final documentation set. What you now have before you is the current ownership and control structure of Burke Enterprises, the Burke family, trust, and all associated property holdings. Greg frantically reviewed these materials, his expression transforming from confusion to disbelief to unmistakable panic as realization dawned. As you will note, I continued with deliberate calmness, controlling interest in all Burke Enterprises holdings and developments remains with me as trustee, with secondary oversight shared between Madeline Burke as legal counsel and this board, as fiduciary representatives. At no point has ownership or control authority for any Burke property, including Westlake Mansion or Riverside Heights development, been transferred to Gregory Williams individually or jointly. The implications settled over the boardroom like steadily descending weight. Every property Greg had claimed in media interviews, every development he had presented as his visionary achievement, every asset he had leveraged for personal advancement, all remained under my legal control. Thomas Blackwell, who had maintained measured neutrality throughout most revelations, finally delivered the assessment that encapsulated collective board recognition. Gregory, these discrepancies extend far beyond operational streamlining or administrative reclassification. They constitute a systematic pattern of misrepresentation to investors, financial institutions, and the public regarding ownership, authority, and resource allocation. Such actions directly contravene the ethical framework upon which Burke Enterprises was established and potentially create significant legal exposure for the company and this board. Greg's increasingly frantic gaze sought Madeline, clearly hoping for some intervention from his wife, but her expression remained professionally neutral. As company counsel, she had sworn ethical obligation to the organization that transcended marital loyalty, particularly given the documented violations presenting potential legal liability. This coordinated presentation represents a fundamental mischaracterization of necessary business innovations, Greg declared, abandoning strategic composure for increasingly transparent desperation. I've devoted 5 years to modernizing this company's operations, expanding market presence, and preparing for sustainable growth in contemporary development landscapes. The boardroom fell silent as I finally rose, commanding attention without raising my voice. Leadership presence developed through decades of navigating complex business environments. Gregory, when Charles and I founded this company, we established non-negotiable principles that would guide all operations regardless of market fluctuations or industry trends. Foremost among these was integrity in communications with clients, communities, employees, and investors. The documentation before this board demonstrates systematic violation of this core principle through deliberate misrepresentation of ownership, authority, and resource allocation. I moved deliberately around the table, each measured step emphasizing the gravity of the moment and my undiminished authority despite Greg's systematic attempts to diminish my role. You positioned my age as liability rather than recognizing the value of institutional knowledge and experience. You treated the Burke legacy as marketing advantage rather than ethical framework requiring consistent application. Most grievously, you undermined my daughter's professional contributions while leveraging her family connection to advance your personal ambitions. Board members' expressions reflected recognition of these observations, having witnessed Greg's subtle but persistent campaign to reposition himself as the company's visionary leader while marginalizing those who had actually built it. The Burkes. Name, I continued, returning to my position at the head of the table. represents 40 years of community investment, ethical development practices, and responsible governance. That reputation wasn't established through media profiles or industry awards, but through consistent actions aligned with clear values. It cannot and will not be compromised by anyone, regardless of position or connection to this family. I nodded to Arthur, who distributed the final documentation set, these bearing the formal letterhead of the Burke Family Trust. The board now has before it proposed leadership restructuring effective immediately upon approval. Greg frantically reviewed these materials, visible shock replacing practiced confidence as he absorbed the comprehensive dismantling of his position. The restructuring removed him from all decision-making authority within Burke Enterprises, while reinstating Madeline to her rightful position as executive vice president and clarifying my continuing role as chairperson and majority shareholder. More devastating still was the section detailing immediate transfer of residence requirements. He would vacate the Burke family estate within 30 days and surrender all access credentials to company properties, including the Westlake Mansion he had claimed as his crowning achievement. "This is outrageous," he finally managed, professional demeanor completely abandoned. "You cannot expect this board to approve such disproportionate response to procedural adjustments implemented for operational efficiency. I've increased company valuation substantially, expanded market presence, and positioned Burke Enterprises for sustainable growth in competitive development environments." His increasingly desperate appeals found no purchase with board members, who had witnessed the systematic campaign to appropriate control through misrepresentation rather than earn it through ethical leadership. Walter Chen, our typically reserved financial director, responded with characteristic precision. "Our analysis indicates that Burke Enterprises' recent performance aligns with sector growth patterns, rather than demonstrating exceptional management impact. When controlling for market conditions and ongoing project pipelines established before your arrival, performance metrics show negligible improvement attributable to your specific operational changes." The clinical assessment, delivered without animosity but with mathematical certainty, undermined the final pillar of Greg's self-constructed narrative as indispensable financial innovator. One by one, board members expressed support for the proposed restructuring, not from personal loyalty to me, but from recognition of documentary evidence requiring decisive governance response. Throughout their deliberations, I maintained composed silence, allowing the process Charles and I had established decades ago to function as intended. Greg's increasingly desperate objections revealed the fundamental character flaws his practiced professionalism had previously concealed: inability to accept accountability, reflexive blame deflection, and profound sense of entitlement to authority. He had attempted to appropriate rather than earn. The formal vote, when finally recorded, was unanimous. Gregory Williams would be removed from all positions within Burke Enterprises effective immediately. Access to company resources, properties, and information systems would terminate by close of business. The Burke family estate, which he had gradually claimed as personal achievement despite its existence long before his arrival, would revert to trust management with relocation arrangements overseen by Arthur's office. The Westlake Mansion renovation would continue under original historical preservation guidelines, with appropriate acknowledgement of contributions made during initial phases, but with correction of ownership misrepresentations in previous media coverage. As board members departed with subdued professionalism despite the dramatic proceedings they had witnessed, Greg remained frozen in devastating recognition of how completely his carefully constructed reality had collapsed. When only Greg, Madeline, Arthur and I remained, I finally addressed my son-in-law directly. "Security will escort you to collect personal belongings from your office. Company devices and materials will remain on premises for comprehensive review. The estate access codes will be changed by this evening, though you'll have scheduled opportunities to retrieve personal items under appropriate supervision." The deliberate calmness of my tone appeared to finally penetrate his shock. "You orchestrated this entire scenario," he said, disbelief yielding to dawning comprehension. While I thought you were gradually stepping back from operational involvement, you were actually documenting everything, just waiting for maximum impact. The accusation contained ironic truth. I had indeed applied strategic patience rather than emotional reaction, gathering comprehensive evidence rather than engaging in counterproductive confrontation. I gathered my materials unhurriedly, the weight of responsibility rather than vindictive satisfaction evident in my deliberate movements. You made fundamental miscalculation, Gregory. You interpreted my patience as passivity, my deliberate observation as disengagement, my institutional knowledge as outdated thinking. Most critically, you saw my age as vulnerability rather than recognizing the strategic advantage of experience. I closed my portfolio with quiet finality. 40 years in business teaches pattern recognition, the ability to distinguish between those who build something lasting and those who merely wish to claim credit for others' achievements. His desperate gaze shifted to Madeline. You're allowing this? Your own husband publicly humiliated and discarded like disposable employee? The attempt to create marital alliance against business necessity revealed another fundamental misconception: his belief that personal loyalty should override professional integrity, that family connection entitled him to exemption from ethical accountability. Madeline finally spoke, her voice steady despite the visible emotion behind her expression. What I'm allowing is the company my parents built to continue operating according to principles they established. What I'm preventing is further misrepresentation of my family's legacy. Security appeared discreetly at the boardroom entrance, necessary precaution given the magnitude of what had transpired and Greg's increasingly erratic responses. This vindictive power play will damage Burke Enterprises far more than any alleged violations you've manufactured, he declared, though the threat sounded hollow even to his own ears. The Sullivan Group, our investors, community stakeholders, everyone recognizes my contribution to recent growth. The media will portray this as dysfunctional family drama rather than legitimate business decision. I smiled slightly, appreciating opportunity for final revelation I had reserved precisely for this moment. Actually, Gregory, business community, stakeholders have already been briefed regarding leadership transition. Arthur has spent the morning updating key investors, development partners, and media contacts, presenting these changes not as dramatic upheaval, but as natural return to founding principles following routine governance review. The calculated precision of this approach, mirroring techniques Greg himself had used to gradually reposition himself while marginalizing me, was not lost on him. His expression collapsed into recognition of complete defeat as I continued. The Sullivan Group has already confirmed they'll proceed with downtown development under original ownership structure. The Historical Preservation Society will announce this afternoon that Westlake restoration continues under traditional Burke Enterprises management, with appropriate acknowledgement of initial contributions. Security stepped forward as Greg remained, immobilized by the comprehensive dismantling of his professional identity and carefully constructed public persona. Mrs. Burke, the senior officer acknowledged respectfully, "We're ready to proceed whenever you give the word." I nodded, maintaining eye contact with Greg one final time. "You excluded me from a ceremony celebrating a marriage and home that existed only through my family's legacy. You dismissed decades of business experience as irrelevant because it came with silver hair and practical shoes. You mistook patience for weakness and institutional knowledge for outdated thinking." I gathered my belongings with unhurried dignity. Most fundamentally, you forgot the essential truth of legacy businesses. Appearance and reality are not the same thing. You had appearance of control while I maintained reality of ownership. Today simply brings these elements back into appropriate alignment. The evening sky painted Westbrook Lake in watercolor purples and golds as I settled onto the dock extending from my cottage's shoreline. 1 month had passed since the board meeting that had fundamentally reshaped Burke Enterprises' leadership structure. The ripples of that necessary intervention had gradually stabilized into new patterns, both professionally and personally. In my hand, I held the invitation that had arrived this morning, embossed with the Sullivan Group's distinctive logo, celebrating the groundbreaking of Westbrook Commons, a Burke-Sullivan partnership. The development that Greg had attempted to reshape into showcase for personal acclaim would proceed according to original vision: balanced community enhancement integrating affordable housing, public green space, and sustainable design principles. The gentle lapping of water against wooden pilings provided soothing counterpoint to my reflections. In the 4 weeks since Greg's removal, Burke Enterprises had not merely survived, but demonstrably thrived. The operational realignment Arthur had implemented with characteristic efficiency had restored departmental functions Greg had systematically marginalized. Victoria's community engagement initiatives, previously designated non-essential public relations, were receiving enthusiastic response from neighborhood associations and cultural organizations. Walter's financial department had completed comprehensive audit revealing how thoroughly Greg's streamlined accounting practices had obscured actual resource allocation while creating misleading performance metrics. Most significant had been stakeholder response to leadership transition. Initial media coverage, carefully managed through strategic communications, had presented organizational changes as planned return to founding principles rather than intervention addressing ethical violations. Business partners had expressed relief rather than concern, many privately acknowledging reservations about Greg's increasingly promotional approach to development projects. Community organizations had enthusiastically welcomed restored emphasis on balanced priorities rather than luxury enhancements that generated media attention without addressing neighborhood needs. My phone chimed with message from Madeline. Finalizing downtown development permits tomorrow. Historical Society thrilled with revised preservation commitments. My daughter had demonstrated remarkable resilience navigating professional responsibilities while managing personal transitions. Her legal expertise had proven essential in correcting documentation Greg had systematically misrepresented, while her institutional knowledge provided invaluable continuity during organizational realignment. Most importantly, she had reclaimed professional confidence Greg had subtly undermined through years of dismissive guidance disguised as supportive partnership. The lake's surface rippled with evening breeze, creating momentary fractal patterns, before reforming into smooth reflection of transitioning sky. Similarly, Burke Enterprises had absorbed the necessary disruption of leadership change, adapting operational patterns while maintaining foundational stability. The institutional framework Charles and I had established through decades of intentional development had demonstrated resilience beyond individual personality, precisely the organizational strength Greg had fundamentally misunderstood when viewing established processes as bureaucratic obstacles rather than essential stabilizing structures. Distant laughter drew my attention to small group enjoying sunset cruise on vintage wooden boat Charles had restored during semi-retirement. Another family asset Greg had claimed in magazine profiles as example of traditional craftsmanship I value in all my projects. The Maritime Restoration Society, now overseeing the vessel's maintenance, had contacted me personally after board meeting, seeking clarification regarding ownership after discovering promotional materials featuring Greg prominently displayed at annual Wooden Boat Festival. Another subtle misrepresentation requiring correction. Another aspect of Burke legacy Greg had attempted to appropriate through confident assertion rather than actual contribution. As darkness settled over the lake, lights began illuminating shoreline homes, each representing distinct family story within Westbrook community. Unlike Greg, who viewed such properties primarily as investment opportunities or status indicators, I recognized the human significance beyond market valuation. Development wasn't merely financial transaction, but community stewardship. Responsibility to enhance shared environments while respecting their existing character and significance. This fundamental principle had guided Burke Enterprises since Charles first established the company, creating sustainable success, transcending market fluctuations and industry trends Greg had prioritized in his misaligned modernization initiatives. My phone chimed again. Arthur confirming tomorrow's meeting with Historical Preservation Commission regarding Westlake Mansion restoration. The property Greg had claimed as his signature achievement was returning to authentic historical accuracy while maintaining practical functionality. Original architectural elements Greg had removed as outdated features incompatible with contemporary lifestyle were being properly restored. Historical materials he had replaced with trendy alternatives reinstated according to preservation guidelines. The commission had expressed particular appreciation for returning to Charles's original vision, prioritizing historical authenticity over fashionable modifications, generating media attention, but compromising architectural integrity. Dock lights activated automatically as complete darkness settled over the lake. Another thoughtful detail Charles had incorporated when designing this waterfront sanctuary. Unlike the elaborate security systems Greg had installed primarily as status signifiers, these practical features served genuine purpose without ostentatious display. Charles had understood that authentic quality required no excessive advertisement, that lasting value manifested through thoughtful functionality rather than superficial impression management. This philosophy had guided Burke Enterprises through decades of sustainable growth while competitors pursuing momentary market advantages ultimately failed to establish enduring presence. I returned to the cottage as evening chill intensified, settling in Charles's study with stack of Community Foundation grant applications requiring review before tomorrow's allocation meeting. Unlike Greg, who had viewed such community engagement primarily as marketing opportunity generating favorable publicity, I recognized authentic community partnership as essential component of sustainable development philosophy. Burke Enterprises' continued support for education initiatives, cultural preservation efforts, and neighborhood enhancement projects represented practical application of founding principles rather than calculated public relations strategy. The distinction between appearance and reality had proven central to Greg's fundamental miscalculation. His professional identity had prioritized creating impressive narratives supported by confident presentation rather than establishing authentic value through consistent ethical practice. When challenged with documented evidence contradicting manufactured image, his entire carefully constructed persona had collapsed spectacularly. By contrast, Burke Enterprises' institutional strength derived from operational infrastructure and established relationships transcending individual personality systems. Greg had attempted to circumvent without recognizing their essential function in creating sustainable success. Morning arrived with characteristic Westbrook mist rising from lake waters, natural display more impressive than any artificial spectacle Greg had favored for development unveilings. I prepared for the day with practiced efficiency, selecting professional attire appropriate for both historical commission meeting and community foundation board responsibilities. Unlike Greg, who viewed clothing primarily as status signifier and personal branding element, I recognized appropriate presentation as practical component of professional function rather than identity performance. The pearl necklace Charles had given me on our 25th anniversary provided meaningful connection to foundational partnership that had created everything Greg had attempted to claim as personal achievement. The drive into downtown Westbrook followed familiar route past, development projects representing Burke Enterprises' evolution across 4 decades. Each property reflected specific historical context and community priorities shaping its creation. The affordable housing complex developed during 1990's economic boom, when other developers prioritized luxury condominiums. The historic theater, renovation-preserving cultural landmark when competitors proposed commercial reconstruction. The riverfront development integrating public access when market trends favored exclusive private enclaves. These projects demonstrated consistent application of founding principles, transcending temporary market advantages or promotional opportunities Greg had prioritized in his misaligned modernization initiatives. Burke Tower emerged through clearing, morning mist, architectural statement Charles had designed to complement rather than dominate Westbrook's evolving skyline. Unlike contemporary glass and steel monuments prioritizing imposing presence over contextual integration, the building incorporated traditional materials and transitional height elements, creating harmonious relationship with surrounding structures. Greg had repeatedly proposed exterior updating to create more dramatic visual impact, unable to appreciate how thoughtful contextual integration, rather than attention-seeking distinctiveness, reflected Burke Enterprises' foundational philosophy regarding community development. The Historical Preservation Commission awaited in Burke Tower's Heritage Conference Room, space specifically designed for community stakeholder meetings rather than impressive client presentations. Elizabeth Harmon, commission chairperson who had previously expressed concerns regarding promotional materials misrepresenting Westlake Mansion ownership, greeted me with visible relief. Mrs. Burke, the Commission has reviewed revised restoration proposals for Westlake property and finds them refreshingly aligned with historical preservation principles. Her emphasis on refreshingly contained unmistakable commentary on previous interactions with Greg's vision, prioritizing contemporary modifications over authentic historical accuracy. The meeting proceeded with productive efficiency, as commission members reviewed detailed restoration plans Howard had prepared according to original architectural documentation Charles had meticulously preserved. Each historical element Greg had dismissed as impractical anachronism was being thoughtfully restored while incorporating appropriate modern functionality without compromising architectural integrity. Commission members expressed particular appreciation for returning to Charles's original approach, balancing preservation principles with practical usability. Philosophy Greg had abandoned in favor of attention-generating contemporary features that undermined historical significance while increasing project costs and extending completion timelines. Following commission meeting, my schedule included lunch with Westbrook Community Foundation board members prior to afternoon grant allocation. Decisions. The restaurant, local institutions supporting regional farmers rather than national chain Greg had preferred for business meetings, provided appropriate setting for discussing community investment priorities with people who actually lived and worked in neighborhoods Burke developments affected. Unlike Greg's approach emphasizing impressive presentations to visiting executives unlikely to experience daily reality of project impacts, this authentic engagement with community stakeholders represented Burke Enterprises' founding commitment to development, creating genuine enhancement rather than merely extracting maximum profit. Foundation board members greeted me with comfortable familiarity, established through decades of consistent community partnership rather than calculated networking strategy. Margaret Reynolds, retired elementary school principal whose educational initiatives Burke Enterprises had supported since inception, expressed particular appreciation for restored emphasis on community engagement following leadership transition. We'd noticed subtle but concerning shifts in priorities over recent years, she observed carefully. Affordable housing components were being reduced, public space allocations minimized, community input sessions increasingly performative rather than substantive. Her observations validated concerns that had ultimately necessitated board intervention, addressing Greg's systematic deprioritization of foundational commitments. The afternoon grant allocation meeting exemplified Burke Enterprises' authentic community partnership approach. Thoughtful discussion balancing available resources against demonstrated neighborhood needs rather than calculating publicity value or marketing opportunities. Unlike Greg's approach prioritizing photogenic initiatives generating favorable media coverage, this process emphasized sustainable impact created through consistent support for initiatives addressing genuine community priorities. The neighborhood literacy program receiving significant funding operated in precisely the type of functional but visually unremarkable facility Greg had repeatedly excluded from promotional materials as insufficiently impressive for crafting his preferred public narrative. Returning to Burke Tower following foundation meeting, I found Arthur waiting with updated media coverage summary regarding leadership transition. Business publications have accepted our framing completely, he reported with professional satisfaction. The Sullivan Group's public endorsement of restored management structure has effectively neutralized any potential controversy. The strategic communications approach, presenting organizational changes as planned realignment rather than crisis intervention, had successfully maintained stakeholder confidence while protecting Burke Enterprises' reputation from unnecessary disruption. Most significant development appeared in afternoon email from Madeline. Settlement terms finalized with Gregory's representatives. No contest regarding prenuptial provisions, no claims against company assets, full confidentiality regarding separation circumstances. The message's professional tone couldn't disguise significant personal milestone this resolution represented. Formal conclusion to relationship that had ultimately revealed fundamental incompatibility between Greg's values and Burke family principles. While maintaining appropriate boundary between corporate governance and personal matters, this development removed final uncertainty regarding potential complications from leadership transition. Late afternoon brought visit to Riverside Heights development, affordable housing initiative Greg had attempted to convert into luxury condominiums before board intervention halted redesign process. Project manager Maria Gonzalez greeted me with evident relief, presenting revised construction documents restoring original community-centered design principles. The neighborhood association representatives actually applauded when we presented restored plans last week, she reported, her expression reflecting professional satisfaction transcending corporate politics. The community garden space Gregory had eliminated has been reinstated, along with childcare facility and public meeting rooms. The site tour revealed how thoroughly Greg had attempted to reshape this development from community enhancement, serving diverse neighborhood needs, into showcase property generating personal acclaim. Each modification, eliminating shared spaces for additional sellable square footage, replacing practical materials with trendy alternatives creating maintenance challenges, prioritizing impressive exterior features over functional interior layouts, reflected prioritization of appearance over substantive value creation. The restored plans returned to Charles's original vision, balancing financial sustainability with genuine community enhancement. Development philosophy, creating lasting positive impact beyond impressive marketing materials. As evening approached, I completed site visit and returned to my waterfront cottage where unexpected visitor awaited. Thomas Blackwell, original investor whose support had proven crucial during Burke Enterprises' formative years, sat on the deck overlooking twilight-painted lake. His presence represented living connection to company history Greg had attempted to rewrite through revisionist narrative, positioning himself as visionary founder rather than temporary caretaker. Unlike Greg's calculated networking with potential status enhancers, Thomas's friendship transcended business partnership to encompass genuine personal connection, established through decades of shared experiences and demonstrated mutual respect. The Sullivan Group contract formalized today, Thomas reported as I joined him overlooking Golden Hour Lake reflections. Downtown development proceeds exactly as originally planned. Affordable housing component intact, historical preservation guidelines maintained, community spaces preserved. This practical confirmation of Burke Enterprises' restored operational integrity provided satisfying conclusion to intervention process, addressing Greg's systematic attempts to reshape company priorities according to personal ambitions rather than foundational principles. Our conversation continued as evening settled over the lake, touching both business developments and personal reflections with comfortable fluidity. Impossible in Greg's rigidly compartmentalized approach to relationship management, Thomas had witnessed Burke Enterprises' entire evolution, from ambitious startup-facing skeptical financing environment to established industry leader maintaining founding principles despite market pressures and leadership transitions. His perspective provided valuable validation that recent intervention had successfully protected essential company character rather than merely resolving specific governance violations. Charles would be proud, Thomas observed as twilight deepened into genuine darkness. not just of correcting Gregory's misrepresentations, but of maintaining the principles you established together through necessary transition. The simple validation from someone who had witnessed our complete journey provided meaningful perspective beyond corporate governance considerations. Burke Enterprises would continue evolving through inevitable market changes and leadership transitions, but foundational commitment to balanced development enhancing communities while creating sustainable value remained consistent through every iteration. As Thomas departed and evening settled into peaceful stillness, I remained on the deck watching moonlight create silver pathways across dark water. The past month had required difficult decisions carrying personal and professional consequences for everyone involved. Yet beneath inevitable emotional complexity lay fundamental simplicity. Principles worth establishing were worth protecting. Legacy worth building was worth preserving. Truth temporarily obscured would eventually emerge. Through patient documentation and strategic intervention, Greg's fundamental miscalculation had been interpreting patience as weakness, institutional knowledge as outdated thinking, and age as liability rather than asset. In dismissing my silver hair and sensible shoes as indicators of irrelevance, he had overlooked the strategic experience, relationship capital, and pattern recognition they actually represented. Most critically, he had forgotten essential truth ultimately proving his undoing. Appearance and reality are not the same thing, and sustainable success requires alignment between them, rather than increasingly elaborate performance maintaining. Artificial separation. Tomorrow would bring new challenges: Historical Preservation Commission recommendations to implement, community foundation initiatives to support, development projects to oversee with restored commitment to founding principles. Madeline would continue navigating professional responsibilities while processing personal transitions, demonstrating resilience Greg had consistently underestimated when positioning himself as essential guide rather than equal partner. Burke Enterprises would maintain operational momentum while implementing strategic realignment, reinforcing foundational commitments temporarily obscured during Greg's leadership tenure. The moon's reflection created perfect mirror image on the lake's still surface, representation exactly matching reality, rather than manufactured narrative contradicting factual circumstances. In excluding me from celebrating marriage and property, ultimately existing only through my family's legacy, Greg had triggered the very reckoning he had worked so diligently to prevent. In dismissing my age as vulnerability rather than recognizing the strategic advantage of experience, he had overlooked the patient documentation and methodical intervention that ultimately revealed the fundamental emptiness behind his carefully crafted persona. The evening breeze carried distant sounds of Westbrook nightlife across the water. Authentic community vitality rather than manufactured social performance Greg had prioritized in his calculated status management. Burke Enterprises would continue creating developments enhancing this community ecosystem while generating sustainable returns, maintaining founding principles that had proven their value through repeatedly changing market conditions and industry trends. The institutional frameworks Charles and I had established provided stable foundation for continued evolution without requiring fundamental compromise of essential character or core commitments. As I finally returned inside the cottage Charles had thoughtfully designed as eventual sanctuary, I passed his portrait hanging in the entryway, visual reminder of partnership that had created everything Greg had attempted to claim through misrepresentation rather than contribution. Charles had understood fundamental truth Greg had never grasped despite business school credentials and calculated professional performance. Lasting legacy requires consistent alignment between stated principles and actual practices, between public narrative and private reality, between claimed achievements and genuine contributions. The cottage welcomed me with familiar comfort, its modest proportions and thoughtful details reflecting authentic quality, requiring no excessive advertisement. Unlike Greg's preference for impressive showcases generating admiration from casual observers, this space embodied substantive value recognized through actual experience rather than superficial impression. The profound satisfaction of restored alignment between appearance and reality, both professionally and personally, provided peaceful conclusion to necessary intervention, addressing temporary disruption rather than permanent deviation from essential character and foundational principles. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.